during every national anthem, like I literally just look around and like soak in the crowd and like take a deep breath because like these are some of the best moments of my life and I get to do it with my best friends, but also.
They say revenge is loud, explosive, obvious, the kind that demands attention the moment it arrives. But the most dangerous kind of revenge doesn't announce itself at all. It doesn't shout. It doesn't warn you. It moves quietly, patiently, reshaping everything before anyone even realizes what's happening. For Caitlin Clark, that moment didn't come with headlines or controversy. It didn't arrive through interviews or social media drama. It came in silence, in control, in a decision so calculated, so unexpected, that it sent shockwaves through the entire structure of women's basketball. She walked away from over $1 million in just 8 weeks of play. Most athletes wouldn't hesitate. Opportunities like that don't come often, and when they do, they're usually taken without a second thought. But she didn't take it. She stepped back. And in doing so, she forced everyone to ask the same question. Why? Because this was never about money. It was about power, timing, control. It was about rewriting a system that had underestimated her from the very beginning. And to understand why that decision mattered so much, you have to go back to where it all started. Not at the height of her fame, not in sold-out arenas or record-breaking performances, but in a moment so quiet it almost went unnoticed. A moment defined by silence. Every downfall, no matter how great the empire, begins with a miscalculation, a blind spot, something small that gets overlooked because success has made you comfortable. For Geno Auriemma, that miscalculation wasn't a bad game or a lost championship. It was something deeper, something far more costly. It was a failure to recognize what was right in front of him. Before the world knew her name, before the records and the national attention, before she became the face of a new era in basketball, Caitlin Clark was just a teenager from Des Moines, Iowa. Like so many young players with big dreams, she looked toward one place as the ultimate destination, UConn. Not just a university, but a dynasty. A program built on dominance. A system that had produced legends like Diana Taurasi, Maya Moore, and Breanna Stewart. For decades, UConn wasn't just successful. It defined success in women's basketball. It was the standard every player measured themselves against. For Clark, it represented the peak. The place where greatness wasn't just expected, it was inevitable. On paper, the connection seemed obvious. A generational talent with limitless range, elite vision, and a fearless approach to the game meeting the most decorated coach in the sport's history. It should have been automatic. But it wasn't. The connection never truly formed. The interest, at least from UConn's side, never fully materialized. There were small signs, indirect contact, brief communication through intermediaries, but nothing concrete. Nothing that signaled she was a priority. And perhaps most importantly, there was one thing missing entirely. A phone call. Geno Auriemma never personally reached out. He never spoke directly to Clark or her family. And in recruiting, silence can speak louder than any words. To a player of her caliber, that silence meant everything. Later, when questions surfaced about how a talent like Caitlin Clark could slip through the cracks, the explanation seemed simple on the surface. Auriemma had already committed to another elite guard, Paige Buchers, and didn't want overlap in the same class. Reasonable, logical, even strategic. But then came the comment that changed how people saw the situation entirely. He suggested that if Clark truly wanted to be part of the program, she should have reached out herself. And that's where everything shifted. Because this wasn't just about recruitment anymore. It was about perception, about expectation, about a system so used to being chased that it no longer felt the need to pursue. For a teenager, one of the most talented players in the country, to be told, directly or indirectly, that the responsibility was on her to prove herself worthy of attention, that wasn't just a missed opportunity. It was a message, one that Clark didn't forget. While UConn moved forward, confident in its decisions, Clark chose a different path. One that, at the time, didn't carry the same prestige or expectation. She chose Iowa. It wasn't the obvious choice. It didn't have the same history, the same banners, the same built-in dominance. To many, it looked like a step down, a fallback option. But what Iowa offered was something far more valuable. Freedom. Under head coach Lisa Blutter, Clark wasn't just another piece in a system. She was the system. From the moment she stepped onto the court, the program didn't try to shape her into something else. It adapted around her. She was given the keys from day one, the freedom to take risks, to make mistakes, to push boundaries without fear of being pulled back. It was an environment built not on control, but on trust. And that trust changed everything. Because when a player like Caitlin Clark is given space, the result isn't just success. It's transformation. What started quietly in Iowa City quickly turned into something impossible to ignore. Packed arenas, viral highlights, a style of play that felt different, faster, bolder, more unpredictable. Her deep-range shooting wasn't just effective, it was disruptive. Defenses couldn't adjust. Coaches couldn't prepare. Every game became an event, every performance a statement. By her freshman year, she wasn't just competing, she was dominating. Averaging over 26 points per game, she immediately established herself as one of the most electrifying players in the country. But it didn't stop there. By her sophomore season, she was leading the nation in scoring. Iowa, once an afterthought in national conversations, became must-watch basketball. Not because of tradition, but because of her. And with every game, every record broken, every arena filled, the implications of that earlier silence grew louder. This wasn't just a player succeeding. This was a shift in power. The kind that forces an entire sport to rethink itself. The kind that exposes flaws in systems that once seemed untouchable. The kind that makes you look back and realize that what felt like a small decision wasn't small at all. It was the moment everything changed. While Geno Auriemma remained focused on protecting the legacy he had spent decades building, guarding it carefully like something fragile that could not be questioned, Caitlin Clark was doing something entirely different. She wasn't protecting anything. She was building something new. Not all at once. Not in one moment. But slowly, deliberately, possession by possession, game by game, arena by arena. What started as flashes of brilliance quickly became a pattern. And that pattern turned into dominance. By the time she reached her junior season, the conversation was no longer about potential. It was about history. Records that had stood untouched for decades suddenly looked vulnerable. Numbers that once defined greatness were no longer safe. And then it happened. Caitlin Clark didn't just break records. She erased expectations. She surpassed Kelsey Plum to become the all-time leading scorer in women's NCAA Division I history. A milestone that, for most players, would define an entire career. For her, it felt routine. There was no dramatic pause. No sense that she had reached a finish line. It was just another game, another performance, another step forward in a journey that never seemed to slow down. But the impact of that moment went far beyond a number on a stat sheet. Because what Clark was doing wasn't just impressive, it was undeniable. You could debate opinions. You could question narratives. But you couldn't argue with what was happening in real time. The numbers were too big. The attention too massive. The shift too obvious. At Carver Hawkeye Arena, something unprecedented was unfolding. A venue that held over 15,000 fans transformed into one of the most sought-after tickets in all of college sports. Sellouts became expected, not exceptional. And it didn't stop there. On the road, the effect was even more striking. Opposing arenas, places that had never seen this level of attention, were suddenly filled to capacity. Fans traveled across states, sometimes across the country, just for a chance to watch her play. It didn't matter if they were cheering for or against her. They just wanted to witness it. Then came the stage that confirmed everything. When Iowa faced LSU in the 2023 NCAA Women's Basketball Championship, the viewership numbers told a story the sport had never seen before. Nearly 10 million people tuned in, making it the most watched game in the history of women's college basketball at that time. It was historic, but it was also just the beginning. 1 year later, in the 2024 NCAA Women's Basketball Championship rematch, that number didn't just increase, it exploded. Nearly 19 million viewers. A figure so massive it didn't just break records, it shattered them completely. For the first time, women's college basketball wasn't chasing relevance. It was setting the standard. Networks took notice. Executives adjusted strategies. Broadcasters restructured entire coverage plans. What had once been treated as secondary programming, games tucked into inconvenient time slots, suddenly became prime viewing. Not because the system changed on its own, because she forced it to. Caitlin Clark didn't stumble into stardom. She didn't benefit from a trend or ride a wave that was already forming. She created the wave. Every deep three-pointer, every no-look pass, every high-pressure performance added to something bigger than just wins and losses. She wasn't just playing the game. She was reshaping it. And perhaps most importantly, she was doing it without asking for approval from anyone who had overlooked her before. She didn't need validation from a system that had once stayed silent. She built her own. And in doing so, she turned Iowa into something no one could ignore. A program without the historic weight of UConn suddenly became the center of the basketball world. That transformation carried a message that echoed far beyond the court. You don't need to be chosen if you're willing to build something undeniable. But while that rise was unfolding in real time, visible on every screen, in every arena, in every conversation, Geno Auriemma watched from a distance. And instead of stepping back and acknowledging what had clearly happened, instead of recognizing that he had missed something extraordinary, he leaned further into the decision that started it all. Pride can be powerful, but it can also be blinding. Rather than openly crediting Clark's impact, his responses followed a pattern. Carefully worded compliments, often wrapped in subtle dismissals. He would acknowledge her confidence, her fearlessness, her style, but always in a way that reduced the scale of what she was actually doing. He described her as someone playing freely, like a kid in a driveway. On the surface, it sounded harmless, even kind. But underneath, it shifted the narrative. It turned discipline into instinct, preparation into spontaneity, mastery into something casual. It suggested that what she was doing wasn't the result of years of relentless work, but something almost accidental. And that framing mattered, because it allowed him to keep control of the narrative he had spent decades building. A narrative where greatness came through his system, through his program, through his structure. But outside that bubble, the reality was becoming impossible to ignore. Caitlin Clark wasn't following a system. She was redefining one. And every time her name came up, comparisons followed. Not organically, but intentionally. Her success was often placed alongside players from UConn, particularly Paige Buchers, as if to remind everyone where greatness was traditionally supposed to come from. But the audience had already moved on. Fans weren't waiting for validation from established powerhouses anymore. They were choosing what to watch, who to follow, what mattered. And increasingly, their choice was clear. Young players weren't just dreaming of wearing UConn blue. They were imitating Clark's style, practicing her shots, wearing her number. That kind of influence doesn't come from tradition. It comes from impact. And it's not something that can be controlled. No matter how many interviews were given, no matter how carefully words were chosen, the shift in power was already happening. Quietly at first, then all at once. The center of gravity in women's basketball was moving. And for the first time in decades, it wasn't anchored in one place. Then came a moment that made the tension impossible to ignore. During an appearance on the Dan Patrick Show in 2024, Geno Auriemma stopped speaking indirectly and addressed the growing hype around Caitlin Clark more directly. But instead of embracing it, he pushed back. Not just against the narrative, but against the people driving it. Fans. He questioned their understanding of the game, suggested that their excitement was misplaced, that their belief in Clark's potential, especially conversations about MVP-level impact as a rookie, was unrealistic, even harmful. And in doing so, he crossed into something far more complicated. Because those fans weren't just voices online. They were the ones filling arenas, buying tickets, wearing jerseys, introducing a new generation to the sport, families showing up together, young girls seeing themselves in a player who made the game feel accessible, exciting, and limitless. Casual viewers who had never followed women's basketball suddenly becoming invested. That energy wasn't artificial. It was real, and it was transforming the sport in ways that couldn't be reversed. Yet in that moment, it was dismissed. But while the noise grew louder, debates, headlines, opinions, Caitlin Clark remained silent. No interviews responding to criticism. No social media reactions. No public statements. Because she understood something that many people don't. The strongest response isn't always spoken. It's shown. And when the time came, she answered in the only way that truly mattered. On the court, the response wasn't subtle. It wasn't quiet. It wasn't open to interpretation. It was definitive. Caitlin Clark didn't answer criticism with interviews or statements. She answered with results. And those results came fast. She was named Rookie of the Year. She earned a place on the All-WNBA first team. And when the MVP voting was finally announced, She finished exactly where many had predicted from the very beginning. Fourth, right where the so-called uninformed fans had placed her months earlier. The same voices that had been dismissed, mocked, and labeled as emotional or unrealistic turned out to be completely right. And that moment did more than validate Clark's performance. It shifted credibility. Because suddenly, the narrative had nowhere left to hide. Every dismissive comment, every subtle jab, every carefully worded attempt to minimize her impact collapsed under the weight of reality. What had once sounded confident now felt outdated. What had once carried authority now felt disconnected from what was actually happening on the court. And at the center of that shift was Geno Auriemma. For decades, he had been one of the defining voices in women's basketball. A figure whose opinions shaped perception, whose programs set the standard, whose approval carried weight. But influence only lasts as long as it reflects reality. And reality had changed. What was once seen as leadership began to look like resistance. What was once confidence started to feel like denial. The role of gatekeeper, the one who decided what mattered and who didn't, began to slip away. Not suddenly, but undeniably. Because the game had moved forward. And it hadn't waited for permission. Still, words alone can only go so far. Commentary has limits. Eventually, influence needs something tangible, something that reconnects authority to relevance. And that's where the next move came in. A new opportunity, a new league, a new attempt to regain control of the narrative. The project was called Unrivaled. Co-founded by Breanna Stewart and Nafisa Collier, it was positioned as a bold step forward for women's basketball. A 3-on-3 format, a fresh structure, significant investment, big ambitions. And behind the scenes, Geno Auriemma was closely connected to its vision. On paper, it had everything. Funding, talent, attention. But there was one problem. It didn't have her. Because by that point, there was only one player in the world who could instantly transform a project like that from promising to unavoidable. One name capable of pulling in casual viewers, driving ticket sales, and giving the league immediate cultural relevance. That name was Caitlin Clark. And after years of distance, dismissals, and indirect criticism, the approach finally came. Reports surfaced that Clark had been offered over $1 million to join the league for an 8-week season. One of the most significant short-term deals ever presented in women's basketball. The irony was impossible to ignore. The same system that hadn't prioritized her now needed her. The same voice that had questioned her impact was now positioned to benefit from it. The same energy that had been pushed aside was now being actively pursued. The roles had reversed. Completely. What once looked like control now looked like dependency. And when the offer reached Clark, the moment carried more weight than just money. Because she wasn't just evaluating a contract. She was recognizing a pattern. This wasn't about opportunity, it was about alignment. About whether she wanted to step into something that, at one point, hadn't fully believed in her. Whether she wanted to tie her momentum to a structure that was now trying to catch up to what she had already built on her own. And her answer came quickly. No. No press conference. No drawn-out negotiations. No carefully crafted statements to soften the moment. Just a decision. Clear, quiet, final. And that decision said more than anything she could have explained publicly. Because she wasn't just turning down a contract. She was turning down the idea that she needed it. She was rejecting the notion that her success required validation from any system, any figure, or any legacy that had once overlooked her. She had already created her own lane, and she had no intention of stepping out of it. That moment, simple on the surface, carried enormous implications. What was meant to be a strategic move, a way to reconnect influence to relevance, instead became something else entirely. A turning point that exposed just how much the balance of power had shifted. Because when Caitlin Clark said no, she wasn't just declining an offer. She was demonstrating independence, control, leverage. And those are the qualities that redefine systems. She didn't argue. She didn't protest. She didn't demand recognition. She simply moved on her own terms. And in doing so, she changed the conversation. Not just about herself, but about the sport as a whole. Because now, the question wasn't who controlled the game anymore. It was who needed who. The ripple effects are still unfolding. A league searching for its centerpiece. A system adjusting to a reality where influence is no longer centralized. A new generation of players watching closely, learning that the path to success doesn't have to follow the blueprint that came before. That authority can be challenged. That timing matters. That power, when used correctly, doesn't need to be loud to be effective. And maybe that's the most important part of this entire story. Because this was never just about one player or one decision. It's about what happens when someone refuses to follow the script. When they recognize their value early and protect it. When they understand that sometimes the strongest move isn't saying yes. It's knowing exactly when to say no. And now, as the next chapter begins to unfold, one question remains. If a single, quiet decision can reshape years of assumed authority, what happens next? Who adapts? Who resists? And when the future of the game fully arrives, who will be ready to lead it? Because one thing is already clear. The old rules don't apply.